In 1932, a farmer named Harold Cutter from rural Tennessee walked into the only general store left standing in his county and offered the owner something that stopped him cold. It wasn't money. Banks had already failed, savings had evaporated, and the paper in Harold's pocket wouldn't buy a loaf of bread. What Harold had was a reputation, a set of hands, and 23 specific skills that his grandfather had taught him before electricity reached their valley. By the end of that year, Harold had not only fed his family of 7 through the worst economic collapse in American history, he had become the most sought-after man in 3 counties. People came to his door before dawn. They left their sick animals, broken plows, dulled tools, and dying gardens. And they left something behind in return: smoked meat, seed corn, wool, leather, medicine, fabric, trust. What Harold understood, and what millions of desperate Americans were relearning in those brutal years between 1929 and 1939, was a truth as old as civilization itself. Skills do not deflate. Skills cannot be seized by a bank. Skills cannot be printed into worthlessness by a desperate government. And certain skills, in certain moments of collapse, become more valuable than gold. Today we are going to look at 20 of those skills. Some will surprise you. Some may even make you uncomfortable, because they describe trades and abilities that modern society has quietly convinced us we no longer need. But the families who survived the Great Depression intact, who kept their children fed and their communities breathing, almost always had at least one person among them who possessed the skills on this list. Stay until the very end, because number 1 is the skill that Depression-era communities considered almost sacred, and it is the one most people today have never even heard of. And before we begin, if this kind of knowledge matters to you, subscribe right now. There are more videos like this coming, and you will not want to miss them. Number 20 on our list is soap making. This sounds simple until you understand what the absence of soap actually means. In the early Depression years, hygiene collapsed in poor rural communities faster than almost anything else. Skin infections, lice, wound infections, and diarrheal illness swept through families who could no longer afford store-bought soap. The families with someone who knew how to render lye soap from wood ash and animal fat never went without. The process required only 2 ingredients that were almost always available: hardwood ash and animal fat from slaughter. You leach the ash in water to create lye, render the fat slowly over heat, combine them in exact proportions, and pour the result into molds. The soap that results is harsh by modern standards but bacterially effective. Women who knew this trade were sought after constantly. They traded bars of soap for food, medicine, and labor. Communities built around a soap maker had measurably lower rates of infection, and the knowledge required no tools that could break or wear out. Everything needed was already in a functioning farmyard. Number 19 is hide tanning. When an animal was slaughtered during the Depression, nothing was wasted, and the hide was often the most tradable part of the entire animal after the meat. But a fresh hide rots within days unless processed. Tanning converts raw hide into leather that lasts for generations. The 2 most common Depression-era methods were brain tanning, which used the animal's own brain matter to soften and preserve the hide, and vegetable tanning using oak bark. A skilled tanner could produce boot leather, harness leather, belt leather, and saddle leather. All of these were in constant demand because leather goods were expensive to purchase and wore out under the brutal physical labor of farm survival. A tanner who could turn your dead cow into a new harness for your surviving horse was worth feeding through the winter. Number 18 is fermentation and food preservation. This goes far beyond making pickles. A skilled fermenter could transform borderline spoiled produce into something shelf-stable and nutritious, could brew medicinal vinegar, preserve meat in brine, culture buttermilk and cheese, and produce small quantities of fermented beverages that held genuine trade value in dry counties. The science behind fermentation was not well understood in the 1930s, but the practice was handed down in kitchens and root cellars across the rural South and Midwest. Women who could look at a surplus of cabbage, cucumbers, or green beans and convert it into months of preserved food were considered essential members of any farming community. Their knowledge of salt ratios, temperature management, and contamination prevention was the difference between a family eating in February and a family going hungry. Number 17 is well digging and water witching. Access to clean water was not guaranteed in rural Depression America. Municipal water systems didn't reach most farming communities, and existing wells could run dry or become contaminated. A man who knew how to read the land for underground water, who understood the geology of aquifer depth, and who had the skill to hand dig or bore a new well without machinery, was worth almost anything a community could offer. Water witching, the folk practice of using a forked stick or copper rod to locate underground water, was controversial even then. But experienced witchers had enough genuine successes that desperate communities paid them in food, livestock, and labor. The actual well diggers, who combined this locating knowledge with the backbreaking and dangerous work of excavating 20, 30, or 40 feet into the earth, were among the highest valued tradespeople in any county. If you have made it this far, and this kind of history matters to you, drop a comment below telling me which skill surprises you most. We read every single one. Now let us keep going. Number 16 is veterinary knowledge. In Depression-era farming communities, an animal was not a pet. It was capital. A draft horse that went lame could mean an entire season's crop was lost. A milk cow with mastitis could mean the difference between children having protein and children going without. Veterinarians existed but were expensive and often distant. The farmers who had accumulated genuine veterinary knowledge through years of observation and practice became essential to their neighbors. They knew how to treat bloat in cattle, how to assist a difficult birth, how to identify and quarantine contagious illness, how to treat common wounds and infections with available materials, and how to make the painful but necessary judgment of when an animal could not be saved. These individuals were paid in meat, in labor, in grain, and in the deep social currency of obligation that held Depression communities together. Number 15 is blacksmithing and metal repair. A broken plow blade in March could destroy a farming family. A cracked axle on the only wagon could strand a family for weeks. The blacksmith was the industrial revolution of the small farm, capable of repairing and fabricating metal objects that every other part of agricultural life depended upon. By the Depression, many small-town smiths had already been pushed out of business by cheap manufactured goods. But when those supply chains broke down and money to purchase replacements disappeared, the surviving smiths found themselves overwhelmed with work. They traded repairs for food, for livestock, for firewood, for anything a community could produce. A man who could work iron with fire, hammer, and anvil was virtually guaranteed not to go hungry. Number 14 is midwifery. Hospital births were already common in American cities by 1930, but the Depression reversed this trend sharply. Paying a hospital and a doctor for a birth was simply impossible for most rural families. Traditional midwives, women with years of hands-on experience in labor and delivery, returned to critical importance. A skilled midwife knew how to manage normal deliveries, how to handle common complications, how to use herbal preparations for pain and hemorrhage control, and, critically, how to recognize emergencies that required intervention. In exchange for attending births, midwives were compensated with food, fabric, livestock, and a place of honor in the community that translated into practical support for years. The knowledge they held was irreplaceable and unteachable from books alone. Number 13 is seed saving and crop knowledge. This one cuts to the very heart of food security. Commercial seed companies existed in the 1930s, but purchasing seeds every season was a luxury that many Depression families could not afford. The farmers who understood how to select, harvest, dry, and store seeds from their current crops to plant the next season held a form of biological wealth that cannot be overvalued. Beyond simply saving seeds, the knowledge of which varieties thrived in local conditions, which were disease-resistant, which produced best in drought or flood years, represented generations of accumulated agricultural intelligence. Families who possessed this knowledge shared it with neighbors, and that knowledge circulated through communities like currency. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe right now so you do not miss what is coming next. Number 12 is root cellar construction and management. Having food is one thing. Keeping food alive through winter is another. The root cellar is one of humanity's oldest food preservation technologies. A chamber below the frost line where consistent cool temperatures and controlled humidity keep vegetables, fruits, and cured meats alive for months. But not all root cellars work equally. The construction requires knowledge of soil drainage, ventilation design, humidity management, and the specific storage requirements of different crops. Apples cannot be stored near potatoes. Carrots require different humidity than squash. The person who understood these interactions and could advise neighbors on building effective storage was helping their community survive winter. They were paid in the same produce they helped preserve. Number 11 is candle and lamp making. Electricity did not reach much of rural America until the late 1930s, and in some areas much later. When families could no longer afford kerosene, darkness became a genuine problem affecting safety, productivity, and the psychological endurance required to survive hard times. Tallow candle making, using rendered animal fat poured around a cotton wick, was a skill many older rural women still possessed. Those who could also construct and repair oil lamps, or who knew how to render and refine oil from various plant sources, provided a service that affected every waking hour of the families around them. Light was not a luxury. It was the extension of productive hours into the evening, and productive hours meant survival. Number 10 is herbal medicine and wound care. The collapse of available medical care during the Depression was swift and severe. Doctors existed, but were unaffordable for most rural families. Hospitals required cash, and the pharmaceutical options available even to those who could pay were limited by modern standards. Into this gap stepped individuals, usually older women, who had maintained knowledge of plant-based medicine passed down through family and community tradition. The ability to identify, harvest, dry, and prepare medicinal plants for specific conditions was not mysticism. Many of the preparations used by Depression-era herbalists have since been validated by pharmacological research. Echinacea for immune support, yarrow for wound bleeding, plantain for infection, elder for fever management, comfrey for tissue healing. The person who could reliably treat a wound without it becoming infected, who could reduce a fever in a child, who could manage the pain of dental problems or arthritis, was providing something with genuine life or death value. Number 9 is spinning and weaving. Clothing wore out. Children grew. Winters came. The machinery of textile manufacturing was running at reduced capacity during the Depression. And even when fabric was available, purchasing it required cash that most families did not have. Women who could take raw wool from a sheep, card it, spin it into thread on a hand spindle or spinning wheel, and then weave or knit that thread into garments were providing something fundamental. Children in properly clothed families stayed healthier. Workers in warm, intact clothing were more productive. Families who did not have to worry about clothing had one less source of the grinding anxiety that broke people psychologically during those years. Spinners and weavers traded their work and their knowledge constantly, and the trade was always well received. Number 8 is beekeeping. Honey was the primary available sweetener when sugar became expensive or unavailable. But honey was not only food. Raw honey is a potent antimicrobial, used for wound dressing and infection prevention throughout human history. Beeswax was essential for candle making, for waterproofing leather, for lubricating tools, and for sealing preserves. A beekeeper who maintained healthy colonies through the Depression was sitting on a production system that required almost no cash inputs and generated multiple trade goods simultaneously. The knowledge required to maintain healthy hives, manage disease, prevent swarming, and harvest without destroying the colony is not trivial. But those who had it found themselves with a reliable stream of trade goods through all seasons. And now something that will surprise many of you. Number 7 is distillation. I am not romanticizing illegal activity. I am reporting history. In the dry counties and dry states of Depression-era America, the ability to distill grain into alcohol was a survival skill that operated in a complex legal gray zone. Medicinal alcohol had genuine uses that were recognized even by prohibition authorities. Fuel alcohol extended scarce petroleum supplies. And the trade value of distilled spirits in communities where they were scarce was enormous. Families that possessed distillation knowledge often used it primarily for apple brandy, cider vinegar, and medicinal preparations, all of which were legal and in high demand. The same equipment and knowledge transferred across these applications. Drop a comment below if you knew this one was on the list. We are almost to number 1, and it is worth waiting for. Number 6 is gunsmithing and ammunition reloading. Hunting was not recreation during the Depression. For millions of rural Americans, it was essential protein procurement. A rifle that could not be repaired was a family that ate less meat. Ammunition that could not be purchased meant a gun that sat useless. The gunsmiths who could repair and maintain firearms, who understood the metallurgy of worn barrels and cracked stocks, and who could reload spent cartridges with salvaged components, were providing a service directly connected to caloric survival. They worked in trade constantly, accepting payment in game meat, hides, farm produce, and labor. Communities with a reliable gunsmith had more successful hunters and more protein in the community food supply. Number 5 is dental extraction and basic dental care. This is brutal and simple. Dental pain in the 1930s could be debilitating, and dentists required cash. Tooth infections could and did kill people by spreading to the jaw and beyond. The individuals who had learned, often from observation and practice rather than formal training, how to perform basic dental extractions using the right tools and enough whiskey, were providing a service that was genuinely life-saving. The knowledge of which herbal preparations provided reliable pain relief, how to recognize an infected tooth before it became a systemic crisis, and how to remove a tooth without breaking the root and leaving infection behind, was some of the most valuable medical knowledge a community could have access to. Number 4 is carpentry and joinery without power tools. Buildings needed repair. Furniture broke. Coffins needed to be built. Farm structures required maintenance. The carpenter who could work with hand tools, who understood joinery that required no metal fasteners because metal was precious, who could true a door frame with a hand plane or splice a broken beam with a scarf joint, was perpetually employed. The Depression-era carpenter did not need electricity or expensive machinery. A well-maintained set of hand tools, the knowledge of wood grain and movement, and the experience to build structures that lasted without modern fasteners or adhesives, made this trade essentially recession-proof. They paid their way in every community they worked in. Number 3 is map-making and land surveying. This one surprises people until they understand the context. Property disputes exploded during the Depression as debts, foreclosures, and migrations scrambled land ownership records. County surveying offices were underfunded and backed up for years. A man who could accurately survey and map a piece of land, establish boundary markers, document water sources and access rights, was providing a service that prevented conflicts that could turn violent. They were paid in land access, in food, and in the deep respect of communities that needed their arguments settled by someone who could read the actual earth. The knowledge of trigonometry, the use of a transit or compass, and the ability to produce a legally credible plat map was rare and consistently valuable. Number 2 is teaching and literacy. Read that again. In the communities where Depression poverty was most crushing, functional literacy was not universal. Children who were pulled out of school to work fields and households fell behind, and in some areas, school systems collapsed entirely for lack of funding. The individual who could teach reading, basic arithmetic, and fundamental writing to children and adults was not providing a luxury. Literacy meant the ability to read contracts before signing them. Arithmetic meant the ability to avoid being cheated in trades. The ability to write meant the ability to communicate with distant family and with government relief agencies that required written applications. Teachers who continued working in exchange for room, board, and community labor were maintaining the human infrastructure that communities needed to recover when better times eventually returned. And now, number 1. The skill that Depression-era communities considered so valuable that its practitioners were sometimes given community land, protected from eviction, and fed through entire winters by the collective effort of their neighbors. The skill that is almost entirely forgotten in the modern world, that no app can replace, that no YouTube tutorial fully transmits, and that the families who survived the worst of the Depression identified again and again in their oral histories as the single most important human capability in a collapsed economy. Number 1 is community organizing and resource allocation, not politics, not ideology. The specific, practical, deeply human skill of knowing who has what, who needs what, who can do what, and how to move resources from surplus to need without allowing the transaction to collapse into conflict, hoarding, or exploitation. The Depression revealed something devastating about human community. Generosity is instinctive, but organization is learned. Families would give their last food to a neighbor in immediate crisis, but without someone who could see the whole picture, who could track the surplus and the shortage across an entire community, who could negotiate the multi-party trades that converted one family's excess wool into another family's seed corn, into a third family's carpentry labor. Resources pooled in the wrong places, trust broke down, and people who could have survived together did not. The individuals who held this skill were not always the loudest. They were not always the strongest or the most educated, but they were the ones who could hold a picture of the community's needs in their mind, who could negotiate across pride and suspicion and fear, who could build the informal economy that kept the formal economy's collapse from becoming complete catastrophe. In oral history after oral history collected from Depression survivors, the same kind of person appears. Someone who knew everybody. Someone who moved through the community without judgment. Someone who could sit down with a proud man who had nothing and help him find something to offer without shaming him. That skill is irreplaceable. It cannot be downloaded. It is built from years of attention, trust, and genuine care for the people around you. The Great Depression did not end because the economy recovered first. In most communities, it ended because people had rebuilt enough trust, enough mutual obligation, and enough informal trade infrastructure to function before the formal economy came back. The skills on this list were the building blocks of that recovery. They were the things that held families together when institutions failed. And here's the question I want to leave you with. Look at this list again. How many of these skills exist in your community today? How many do you personally possess, even partially? Because the families that survived the Depression had been building these skills for generations before they needed them. They were not preparing for collapse. They were simply living in a way that produced competence. If you know someone who still has these skills, find a reason to sit with them. Ask them to show you. The knowledge is still there if you know where to look. Comment below with the skill from this list that you think is most important for people to relearn today. And if this video meant something to you, share it with one person who you think needs to see it. That single share is worth more than any algorithm boost. Thank you for watching.